The land remembers what men try to forget. Autumn sunlight filters through oak leaves as a weathered farmer's hands trace the edges of a foreclosure notice. 20 yards away, his shotgun leans against the porch rail, a relic from another life, another war. 3 generations of sweat soaked into this soil, and the bank wants it gone in 30 days. In the silent woods marking his eastern boundary, something metal glints where no metal should be. A camera, watching, waiting. The farmer isn't supposed to notice, just like no one was supposed to notice when the creek water changed, when the cancer clusters formed, when the corporate vehicles began appearing on county roads. Just like no one was supposed to ask why his wife's research disappeared after her funeral. The trap is set, not just the steel-jawed monstrosity hidden among autumn leaves, but the larger trap of silence, of money, of power that crushes truth beneath its heel. Some storms arrive with thunder. Others come with the quiet click of a loaded chamber. Robert Bob Caldwell's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his ancient Ford pickup as the first fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky. The truck rattled over the uneven dirt road that wound through his property, its familiar complaints a soundtrack to his morning routine. At 58, Bob's face carried the etchings of decades under the Midwest sun, deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, skin tanned and roughened by seasons spent tending to the land. The radio crackled with the morning agricultural report, the forecaster's voice cutting in and out as the truck navigated the rolling terrain of Oak Creek Valley. Commodity prices continuing their downward trend for the third consecutive month. Midwest farmers facing potential losses. Corporate acquisitions of family farms reaching a 10-year high. Bob reached over and snapped it off. He didn't need a radio to tell him what he already knew. The 120-acre farm that had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations was hanging by a thread. And that thread was fraying fast after 3 years of drought and plummeting crop prices. "What do you think, Duke?" he asked the aging German shepherd beside him. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name, but his eyes remained fixed on the passing landscape, ever vigilant. "Think we'll get that rain they've been promising." Duke offered a low whine in response as Bob steered the truck toward the eastern boundary of his property. The morning inspection had become more important lately. 3 neighboring farms had already been sold to Heartland Agricultural Investments, a subsidiary of some faceless corporation out east. Strange vehicles had been spotted on the county roads. Men in expensive SUVs with city plates, looking out of place against the backdrop of cornfields and open sky. The truck crested a small hill, and Bob slowed to a stop. From this vantage point, he could see most of his eastern acreage, the cornfields ready for harvest, the old oak grove that had given the valley its name, and beyond that, the property line where his land butted up against what used to be the Johnson place before the bank took it. Something caught his eye, a flash of metal in the tree line that shouldn't have been there. Bob narrowed his eyes, scanning the area more carefully. "Stay!" he commanded Duke as he climbed out of the truck, reaching behind the seat for his binoculars. The morning air held autumn's bite, and his breath formed small clouds as he trained the binoculars on the tree line. There it was again, definitely metal, definitely not belonging to anything of his. Bob returned to the truck, this time retrieving the shotgun he kept secured behind the seat. He hadn't served 20 years in the Army to be caught unprepared on his own land. "Come on, boy," he said to Duke. "Let's check it out." "I'll run on him." They moved across the field with practiced efficiency, Bob's boots crushing the fallen leaves as they approached the tree line. Duke's posture changed, his body lowering slightly, ears forward. He'd spotted something. "Easy," Bob murmured, adjusting his grip on the shotgun. As they reached the trees, Bob spotted it, a small, sophisticated camera mounted on a tree trunk, its lens oriented toward his property. Next to it, barely visible and carefully camouflaged, was a motion sensor. "What the hell?" he muttered, examining the device without touching it. This was no hunter's trail camera. The equipment was high-end, the kind used for professional surveillance. Someone was watching his land, and they hadn't bothered to ask permission. Duke growled, his attention shifting to something deeper in the woods. Bob tensed, listening. The snap of a twig, too deliberate to be wildlife, came from about 50 yards to his right. "Who's there?" Bob called out, raising the shotgun to a ready position. "You're trespassing on private property." Silence. Then the unmistakable sound of someone moving quickly through the underbrush. Retreating. "Stay!" Bob commanded Duke again, then moved swiftly in the direction of the sound. His years in the military had taught him how to move through terrain like this, and despite his age, he closed the distance rapidly. He caught a glimpse of a figure male, dark clothing, moving with purpose, and then the man turned, spotted Bob, and broke into a run. "Hey!" Bob shouted. "Stop right there!" The man ignored him, crashing through the underbrush toward what must have been a vehicle parked on the old service road that ran along the edge of the property. Bob pursued, his breath coming harder now, the familiar burn in his lungs reminding him he wasn't 25 anymore. The man reached a black SUV with tinted windows and no visible markings. As he yanked the door open, Bob finally caught up, grabbing the man's shoulder and spinning him around. "Who the hell are you?" Bob demanded, keeping the shotgun pointed at the ground but ready. The man was younger than Bob by at least a decade, with close-cropped hair and the build of someone who spent considerable time in a gym rather than working land. His eyes flicked to the shotgun, then back to Bob's face, calculating. "Private investigator," he said smoothly, reaching slowly toward his jacket. "I'm just doing my job." "Don't," Bob warned, raising the shotgun slightly. "Keep your hands where I can see them. What's a private investigator doing setting up cameras on my property without permission?" The man's expression hardened. "Look, Mr. Caldwell, you should walk away from this. Some things are bigger than your little farm problems." The fact that the man knew his name sent a chill down Bob's spine. "You're on my land. That camera is on my land. Either you start explaining, or I'm calling the sheriff." A flicker of something amusement crossed the man's face. "Go ahead. Call Sheriff Myers. See how far that gets you." Before Bob could respond, the man moved with unexpected speed, shoving Bob backward and diving into the SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle peeled away, spraying gravel and leaving Bob standing in a cloud of dust, his mind racing with questions. Duke appeared at his side, hackles raised as they watched the SUV disappear. Bob reached down to pat the dog's head, his thoughts turning to the man's parting words. What did he mean about Sheriff Myers, and what was happening on his land that warranted professional surveillance? The camera. Bob turned and headed back to examine it more closely. Whatever was going on, that camera might hold some answers. As he reached the device, Bob heard something else, a faint, human sound coming from deeper in the woods. He froze, listening. There it was again, a moan, followed by what might have been a call for help. "Hello," Bob called out, moving cautiously toward the sound. Duke took the lead, nose to the ground, leading them off the path and into thicker underbrush. The sound came again, closer now, definitely human and definitely in distress. Bob pushed through a dense patch of brambles and stopped cold at what he saw. A woman lay on the ground about 20 yards ahead, her leg caught in what appeared to be a hunting trap, not the kind local hunters use for small game, but something more sophisticated and far more vicious. Blood stained the fallen leaves around her, and her face was pale with shock and pain. Bob moved quickly to her side, Duke circling the area, alert for danger. "Ma'am, try not to move," Bob said, kneeling beside her. "I'm going to help you." The woman's eyes snapped to his face, intelligent, dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain, fear, and unmistakable determination. She was in her early 50s, Bob guessed, with silver streaking through her dark hair, dressed in practical hiking gear that had seen better days. "Who are you?" she managed through clenched teeth. "Robert Caldwell. This is my land. That trap shouldn't be here." Bob examined the mechanism carefully. It was nothing like the simple traps occasionally used by local hunters. This was a professional-grade device, designed to immobilize rather than kill, with serrated edges that had dug deeply into the woman's leg. "I need to get this off you," he said. "It's going to hurt." She nodded once, her jaw set. "Do it." Bob positioned his hands on the trap's release mechanism, memories of field medicine training from his Army days surfacing. On three, 1, 2. He moved on, too, hoping to catch her before she could tense up. The trap's teeth released with a metallic screech, and the woman bit back a scream, her hands digging into the earth beneath her. Blood flowed more freely now, and Bob quickly removed his flannel shirt, tearing it into strips to create a makeshift pressure bandage. As he worked, he kept his voice calm and steady. "What's your name? What were you doing out here?" She hesitated, watching him bandage her leg with practiced efficiency. "Kate," she finally said. "Kate Wilson. I'm an environmental scientist. I was taking water samples from the creek when I ran into some trouble." Something about her explanation didn't quite ring true, but Bob had more immediate concerns. "This isn't an animal trap, Miss Wilson. Someone set this for a person. For you. Maybe." Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that they both knew there was more to the story. "We need to get you to a hospital," Bob said, securing the last of the bandages. "No hospitals," she replied sharply. "No authorities. Please." Bob sat back on his heel and studying her face. "That leg needs proper medical attention." "None. Are you familiar with field medicine, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her gaze dropping to his hands, which had worked with military precision. "Army, 20 years, he admitted, "but I'm no doctor. It will have to do." She tried to push herself up and gasped as pain shot through her injured leg. Without hesitation, Bob moved to help her, but the sudden crack of a gunshot froze them both. A bullet splintered the tree trunk inches from Bob's head, sending bark flying. "Down!" Bob commanded, shielding the woman with his body as he reached for his shotgun. Duke barked sharply, facing the direction of the shot. 2 more shots rang out, closer this time. Whoever was firing was moving toward them. "Can you move at all?" Bob asked, scanning the trees for any sign of the shooter. "With help," she gritted out. Bob nodded, formulating a plan. "When I say go, I'm going to help you up. We need to make it to those rocks about 30 yards east. They'll provide cover while I deal with our friend." "Deal with? You're going to engage an armed assailant?" She looked at him with disbelief. Bob checked his shotgun. "Not my first rodeo, ma'am." He positioned himself to help her up, counting down quietly. 3, 2, 1, go. They moved as one, Bob supporting most of her weight as they half ran, half stumbled toward the outcropping of rocks. More shots came, but the shooter's aim was compromised by their movement and the dense trees. Once Kate was safely behind the rocks, Bob turned his attention to the shooter. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before, using the terrain to his advantage, circling around to approach from a different angle. The shooter, another man in dark clothing, similar to the private investigator, was moving cautiously through the trees, rifle raised. He hadn't spotted Bob yet, his attention focused on the rocks where Kate was hiding. Bob positioned himself behind a large oak, waiting for the right moment. As the man passed his position, Bob stepped out, shotgun leveled. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. The shooter whirled, bringing his rifle to bear, but hesitated at the sight of Bob's shotgun aimed at his chest. That moment of hesitation was all Bob needed. He closed the distance quickly, the butt of the shotgun connecting solidly with the man's jaw. The shooter went down hard, his rifle clattering to the forest floor. Bob kicked the weapon away, then quickly checked the man for other weapons, finding a handgun and a military-grade radio, which he confiscated. The man was unconscious, but breathing. Bob had made sure of that. He wasn't in the business of killing, not anymore. Using the man's own belt and shoelaces, Bob secured him to a tree, then retrieved the rifle and headed back to Kate. He found her exactly where he'd left her, her face even paler now, but her eyes alert and watching for his return. Duke sat beside her, apparently having appointed himself her guardian in Bob's absence. "We need to move," Bob said, helping her to her feet. "There might be more of them." "There usually are," she murmured, leaning heavily against him as they began making their way back toward his truck. The trek through the woods was slow and painful for Kate, but she didn't complain once. Bob found himself impressed by her resilience, whoever this woman was. She was no stranger to hardship. "Who are these people?" Bob asked as they paused for her to catch her breath. "What do they want with an environmental scientist?" Kate's eyes met his, measuring, calculating. "It's complicated. Mr. Caldwell." "Bob," he corrected automatically. "And getting shot at on my own land makes it my business. Complicated or not." She nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but not here." Once we're somewhere secure, they reached the truck without further incident, though Bob remained vigilant, scanning the tree line constantly. He helped Kate into the passenger seat, then whistled for Duke, who jumped into the back with practiced ease. As they drove back toward the farmhouse, Bob watched Kate from the corner of his eye. She sat straight despite her injury, her gaze taking in everything the fields ready for harvest. The weathered barn in the distance, the farmhouse that had stood for over a century. There was something in her assessment that went beyond casual observation, something almost professional in its thoroughness. "Environmental scientist." "Huh," Bob said, breaking the silence. A small smile touched her lips. Among other things, the farmhouse came into view, 2 stories of white clapboard with a wide front porch, a black tin roof, and windows that had witnessed generations of Caldwell history. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and well-maintained, a testament to Bob's determination to preserve his family's legacy despite mounting financial pressures. Bob parked close to the front steps and helped Kate inside, settling her on the living room sofa. The interior of the house reflected its owner, practical, unpretentious, with furniture chosen for comfort rather than style. Family photos lined the mantel above the stone fireplace, tracking the Caldwell family through the decades. "I'll get my first aid kit," Bob said, heading toward the kitchen. "It's a bit more extensive than most." When he returned with the large metal box bearing Army medical insignia, Kate was examining a photo on the end table, Bob in uniform standing beside a smiling woman with kind eyes and a young girl of about 12. "Your family," she asked as he set the kit down and began sorting through supplies. "My wife, Eleanor, and our daughter, Lisa," Bob replied, his voice softening. "Eleanor passed 7 years ago. Cancer." He kept his focus on the medical supplies, not meeting Kate's eyes. "Lisa's in Seattle now, works for some tech company." "I'm sorry about your wife," Kate said quietly. Bob nodded his acknowledgement, then gestured to her injured leg. "I need to clean this properly. It's going to hurt worse than when I removed the trap." "Go ahead," she said, setting the photo down carefully. "I've had worse." Something in her tone made Bob look up, meeting her eyes. There was a story there, one he suspected few people had heard. As he cleaned and properly dressed her wound, Bob noted that Kate bore the pain with remarkable stoicism, her only reaction an occasional sharp intake of breath when he had to dig deeper to remove debris from the trap. "The good news is, no major arteries were hit," he said as he finished applying a proper pressure bandage. "The bad news is, you've got some deep tissue damage that really should be seen by a doctor." "You did fine," Kate assured him, examining his handiwork. "Military medical training. Combat medic for my first tour," Bob confirmed. "Picked up a few things that stuck with me." "Lucky for me." She attempted to shift position and winced. "You should rest," Bob said, standing to gather the used medical supplies. "I've got a guest room downstairs you can use. Belonged to my mother-in-law in her later years." Kate's expression turned wary. "Mr. Caldwell, Bob, you've been very kind, but I shouldn't stay. Those men, they'll come looking." "Probably," Bob agreed calmly. "But you're in no condition to go anywhere, and I have a feeling they'd find you whether you're here or not." He paused when studying her face. Besides, I've got questions that need answering, starting with why there's surveillance equipment on my property and men with guns chasing an environmental scientist through my woods. Kate held his gaze and then sighed. You deserve answers. But not all of them will be ones you want to hear. Truth rarely is, Bob replied, but I prefer it to comfortable lies. He glanced at his watch. I've got chores that need doing. You get some rest, and we'll talk after. He helped her to the guest room, a simply furnished space with a comfortable bed and windows that looked out over the eastern fields. Duke followed, settling himself on the rug beside the bed, as if he'd appointed himself her personal guardian. Looks like you've made a friend, Bob observed. Kate smiled, reaching down to pat the dog's head. Always been good with animals. They're better judges of character than most people. Bob nodded, then headed for the door. I'll check on you in a couple of hours. Try to rest. As he closed the door behind him, Bob's thoughts churned with questions. Who was this woman really? What kind of trouble had followed her onto his land? And why did he have the unsettling feeling that whatever she was involved in was about to become his problem too? Outside, he paused on the porch, surveying his land with a critical eye. The harvest couldn't wait much longer, but now he had injured strangers and armed men to deal with. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the private investigator's comment about Sheriff Myers nagged at him. With a sigh, Bob headed toward the barn. Whatever storm was brewing, he'd weathered worse. For now, the farm needed tending, mysterious woman or not. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Bob finished the last of the day's chores. His back ached from hours spent preparing equipment for the upcoming harvest work that would normally be shared among several people. But the financial strain of recent years had forced him to let go of his hired help. Now it was just him, pushing his aging body through tasks designed for men half his age. As he washed up at the outdoor pump, the sound of tires on gravel caught his attention. He turned to see a familiar Sheriff's Department SUV coming up the drive, and his conversation with the private investigator from that morning immediately came to mind. Sheriff Frank Myers had been Oak Creek's top lawman for nearly 15 years. In his late 40s, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a belly that spoke of too many nights at the Rusty Nail Tavern. Myers was neither the best nor the worst sheriff the county had seen. He'd always been cordial enough with Bob, though they ran in different circles. Bob dried his hands on a rag and walked out to meet the approaching vehicle, mentally preparing for whatever this visit might bring. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he called as Myers climbed out of his vehicle. "Bob," Myers acknowledged with a nod. "Thought I'd stop by, see how things are going out here." Bob's guard went up immediately. Myers had never made social calls to the Caldwell farm before. "Things are going," Bob replied neutrally. "Getting ready for harvest. What brings you all the way out here?" Myers surveyed the farmyard, his gaze lingering on the house. "Heard there might have been some trouble on your east property line this morning." "Gunshots." Bob kept his expression neutral. "That right who reported it?" Myers shrugged. "Anonymous call. Said they heard shots while hiking near your place. Not much hiking happens on private property." "Sheriff," Bob pointed out. "And I haven't reported anything." "So there wasn't any gunfire," Myers pressed, his eyes now fixed on Bob's face. "Did some target practice earlier?" Bob lied smoothly. "Getting ready for deer season." Myers nodded slowly, clearly not believing him but unwilling to push further without cause. "Mind if I take a look around? Just to be thorough." "Actually, I do mind," Bob said, crossing his arms. "Unless you've got a warrant, this is private property." Something flashed in Myers's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or something more calculated. "Come on, Bob, just trying to do my job here. And I'm just exercising my rights," Bob replied evenly. "If there's been a crime reported, I'd be happy to make a statement at your office tomorrow." Myers studied him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "All right, have it your way. But Bob," he took a step closer, lowering his voice, Word is, Heartland Agricultural is making offers on every piece of land in this valley. Might be smart to at least hear what they have to say. The abrupt change of subject caught Bob off guard. What's Heartland got to do with gunshots? Sheriff Myers smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just saying, times are changing. Smart man knows when to cash out. He glanced at the house again. You all alone out here these days? The hair on the back of Bob's neck stood up. Duke keeps me company, he said, gesturing to where the German shepherd had appeared in the doorway of the barn, watching the exchange with alert eyes. Good dog, Myers commented, though he took a subtle step back toward his vehicle. Well, if you change your mind about making a statement, you know where to find me. Bob watched as the sheriff's SUV made its way back down the drive, dust billowing in its wake. Only when it had disappeared from view did he allow the tension to leave his shoulders. Inside the house, he found Kate sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of water before her, and a look of concern on her face. You heard all that? Bob asked, filling a glass for himself from the tap. Enough, she confirmed. Your sheriff seems very interested in your property. Bob leaned against the counter, studying her. She looked better after a few hours of rest. Some color had returned to her face, though pain still tightened the corners of her eyes. Seems interested in a lot of things, Bob said, including whether I'm alone out here. Kate's expression darkened. They're moving faster than I expected. Bob set his glass down. I think it's time for those answers you promised. Ms. Wilson, if that's even your name. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. It's not. My name is Victoria Reynolds. Tori, to the few people who know me well. The name hit Bob like a physical blow. Reynolds as in Reynolds Environmental Solutions. Tori nodded, watching his reaction carefully. I was CEO until 18 months ago, when I disappeared rather publicly from my own life. Bob pulled out a chair and sat heavily. Reynolds Environmental Solutions was one of the largest private companies in the country, specializing in waste management and environmental remediation. Their logo appeared on everything from recycling plants to corporate sustainability reports. And if memory served, the company had been in the news recently due to the mysterious disappearance of its leader. The woman who vanished, Bob said slowly, recalling headlines that had flashed across his rarely watched television. There was a massive search, theories about kidnapping, even suicide. All very convenient narratives, Tori said with a humorless smile. Much better than the truth that I fled with evidence of criminal wrongdoing that could bring down not just Reynolds Environmental, but half a dozen major corporations and several elected officials. Bob processed this, connecting dots that suddenly formed a much more troubling picture. The trap in the woods, the men with guns, they're looking for you. They found me, she corrected grimly. I've been careful 18 months of staying ahead of them, moving constantly, gathering more evidence. But someone made a mistake, or I did, and now they know I'm in Oak Creek Valley. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Bob asked, though a sick feeling in his stomach told him he already knew part of the answer. Tori's expression hardened. Evidence that Reynolds Environmental, under the direction of my half-brother Harrison, has been illegally dumping toxic waste into groundwater systems across 5 Midwest states for the past decade. Evidence of bribes paid to local officials to look the other way. Evidence of a deliberate cover-up when cancer rates in affected communities began to rise. Bob felt the blood drain from his face. Cancer rates. Tori's eyes softened with sudden understanding. Your wife. Eleanor was diagnosed with a rare form of liver cancer, Bob said, his voice rough with emotion he thought he'd buried years ago. Doctors couldn't explain it. She was healthy, didn't drink, didn't smoke, then suddenly stage 4. Gone in 8 months. I'm so sorry, Tori said quietly. When did she get sick? 9 years ago. Diagnosed 8 years ago. Bob's mind was racing now, connecting dates, recalling conversations with neighbors who had also lost loved ones to unexplained illnesses. There were others in the valley. The Johnsons lost their teenage son to leukemia. Old man Patterson. Liver cancer. Same as Eleanor. We all thought it was just bad luck. It wasn't luck, Tori said, her voice laced with controlled anger. It was deliberate, criminal negligence. And when reports of unusual cancer clusters began to surface, Reynolds Environmental, my company, paid to have them buried. Bob stood abruptly, unable to sit still with the implications of what she was saying. You're telling me your company killed my wife, killed our neighbors, and now what you've grown a conscience? Tori didn't flinch from his anger. I didn't know. Not until 18 months ago when one of our environmental compliance officers committed suicide. He left a note and documentation detailing what had been happening. Operations I thought were legitimate waste processing facilities were actually dumping grounds. Safety reports I'd reviewed and signed off on had been falsified before they reached my desk. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. The moment I discovered what was happening, I began gathering evidence. When I confronted Harrison and the board with what I'd found, they made it very clear that I had two choices: play along or disappear permanently. So you disappeared on your own terms, Bob concluded, his anger not diminished but now directed elsewhere. With every piece of evidence I could download, she confirmed. It's all on a secure drive, encrypted. If anything happens to me, it automatically sends everything to the FBI, EPA, and major news outlets. Dead man's switch, Bob said, remembering similar protocols from his military days. Tori nodded. Which is why they can't just kill me. They need to discredit me, have me declared mentally unstable, bring me in quietly where they can control the narrative. Bob paced the kitchen, processing everything she'd told him. If what she was saying was true and his gut told him, it was then the implications went far beyond his farm or even Oak Creek Valley. The surveillance camera I found this morning, he said. The men in the woods, they're hunting you. Yes, and the sheriff is involved somehow. Local law enforcement is often the first target for bribes, Tori said grimly, especially in areas where operations are active. Bob stopped pacing, a new thought occurring to him. Heartland Agricultural, the company buying up local farms, they're connected to this. Tori's expression confirmed his suspicion. Heartland is a shell company, created to acquire land that might be affected by contamination. Buy it cheap, before anyone realizes the groundwater is toxic. Then either flip it to unsuspecting developers or use it to bury evidence of wrongdoing. Son of a bitch, Bob muttered, the full scope of the conspiracy beginning to dawn on him. They've bought 3 farms in the valley already, been making offers on at least a dozen more, including mine. Your property would be particularly valuable to them, Tori noted. Your eastern border runs along Oak Creek itself, one of the main waterways they've been using. Bob's mind flashed to the letter he'd received that morning, another notice from Midwest Agricultural Bank, warning that his loan was in default and foreclosure proceedings would begin within 30 days if payment wasn't received. The timing suddenly seemed far less coincidental. They're trying to force me out, he realized aloud. The bank calls in my loan. I can't pay. Heartland swoops in to save me with a cash offer well below market value. Standard operating procedure, Tori confirmed. They've done it dozens of times across the Midwest. Bob looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the environmental scientist disguise to the woman beneath a woman who had given up everything to expose a truth that had already cost too many lives. What's your plan? He asked finally. Originally gather enough evidence to bring the whole operation down without leaving room for legal maneuvering. Expose not just the environmental crimes, but the corporate and political corruption that allowed them to happen. She sighed, gesturing to her injured leg. Now I need to recover enough to move again. Find a secure location to finish compiling everything I've gathered. And then, justice, she said simply. For your wife, for everyone who suffered because of what my company did, no matter the personal cost. Bob was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. He'd never been one to seek out trouble, but he'd never been one to run from it either. You'll stay here while you heal, he said finally, his decision made. They already know you're in the area, and they suspect you're on my property. Moving you now would only put you at more risk. Tori studied his face. You understand what you're getting into. These people won't stop. They have resources, connections. So do I, Bob replied grimly. 20 years in the Army doesn't just teach you field medicine. It teaches you how to fight when you're outnumbered. Why would you help me? Tori asked, genuine confusion in her voice. I represent the company that may have caused your wife's death. Bob looked at the photo of Eleanor on the mantel, her smile forever frozen in time. Because Eleanor would have wanted me to, because it's the right thing to do, and because I'm damn tired of corporations thinking they can sacrifice people like us for their bottom line. A sudden series of sharp barks from Duke interrupted them. Bob moved quickly to the window, peering out cautiously at what had alerted the dog. We've got company, he said, reaching for the shotgun he'd propped by the door. And it's not the sheriff this time. Through the gathering dusk, they could see headlights approaching not one vehicle but three, moving with purpose up the long driveway. They're here for me, Tori said, attempting to stand despite her injury. I need to go. Lead them away from... You're not going anywhere. Bob cut her off, checking the shotgun's load. Not on that leg, and not when we finally have some answers worth fighting for. He moved to a cabinet near the back door, unlocking it to reveal several firearms, hunting rifles, a handgun, and boxes of ammunition. The collection of a man who had prepared for trouble long before it arrived. Can you shoot? He asked, glancing back at Tori. A grim smile touched her lips as she reached for the handgun. Corporate America isn't as different from a war zone as people think. Bob nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. Then let's give our visitors a proper welcome. As the vehicles drew closer, Bob quickly outlined his strategy. 20 years of military service had taught him that superior numbers and equipment could be overcome with the right tactics and terrain advantage. And if there was one thing Bob Caldwell knew, it was every inch of the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The approaching storm would be met with a force they never expected from a supposedly desperate farmer and an injured woman. Whatever came next. Bob knew one thing for certain: the truth about Eleanor's death, about all the deaths, would not stay buried any longer. The vehicles spread out as they approached the farmhouse. 2 black SUVs, identical to the one Bob had encountered earlier, and a larger, more imposing silver Lincoln Navigator. Their headlights cut through the early evening gloom, illuminating the weathered barn and stretches of the yard in harsh white light. Bob watched from the darkened window of the living room, shotgun ready but not visible to those outside. Years of combat experience had taught him the value of information, knowing your enemy before they knew you. 5 men from the SUVs, he reported quietly to Tori, who had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway. Out of sight, but with a clear line of fire if needed. Military posture, moving with tactical spacing. Not just hired muscle, these guys have training. Private security, Tori confirmed. Harrison uses a firm staffed almost exclusively with ex-special forces. Expensive, but effective? Bob continued his assessment. Driver still in the Navigator. Someone else in the back seat. He narrowed his eyes, studying the silhouette visible through the tinted windows. Can't make them out clearly. Probably Harrison, Tori said, her voice tight. He likes to observe, but keep his hands clean. The 5 men from the SUVs had formed a loose perimeter around the farmhouse. One approached the front door directly while the others maintained positions of tactical advantage. Bob noted their professionalism with grudging respect. These weren't amateurs. The sharp knock that came was expected, but still sent a jolt of adrenaline through Bob's system. He nodded to Tori, who had flattened herself against the wall, out of sight from any windows. Mr. Caldwell. A deep voice called through the door. We need to speak with you. It's a matter of some urgency. Bob moved to the door but didn't open it. Kind of late for social calls, he called back. And I don't believe we've met. My name is Mercer. I represent certain interests that have concerns about your property. If we could speak inside, I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. I'm not in the habit of inviting armed men into my home. Mr. Mercer, Bob replied, whatever you have to say, you can say from there. A pause, then. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive, Mr. Caldwell, a dangerous, mentally unstable woman who has stolen corporate property and may be armed. For your own safety, we need to search your premises. Bob allowed himself a small, grim smile. They were being careful, no direct threats, no admission of who they really worked for, just enough plausible deniability to cover whatever came next. Unless you've got a badge or a warrant, you've got no right to search anything, Bob responded. And the only danger on my property right now is trespassing. Another pause. Longer this time. Bob could almost hear the men outside recalibrating their approach. Mr. Caldwell, Mercer's voice came again, harder now. You don't understand the situation you found yourself in. The woman you're protecting is not who she claims to be. She's wanted for corporate espionage and theft of proprietary information. If you turn her over to us now, there will be no consequences for your involvement. And if I don't, Bob asked, though he already knew the answer, then we can't be responsible for what happens next. Bob exchanged a glance with Tori, who nodded grimly. They'd expected the pretense of negotiation before force was applied. Here's my counteroffer, Bob called through the door. You and your men get back in your fancy vehicles and leave my property immediately. Otherwise, I start making phone calls FBI, state police, maybe a few reporters I know from my Army days. I'm thinking they'd be very interested in why armed men are threatening a farmer on his own land. A longer silence followed, then the sound of a car door opening and closing. New footsteps approached the porch lighter, more measured. Robert, a new voice called, cultured and commanding. My name is Harrison Reynolds. I believe you have my sister. Bob saw Tori stiffen at the sound of her half-brother's voice. Her knuckles whitened around the grip of the handgun. Mr. Reynolds, Bob acknowledged, not revealing whether the name meant anything to him. Your sister, Victoria Reynolds, Harrison replied smoothly. Though she may have given you another name. She's been unwell for some time. Early onset dementia, exacerbated by stress. Our family has been searching for her for 18 months. Bob had to admire the man's delivery concern, perfectly modulated, the lie delivered with just enough detail to sound plausible. If he hadn't already known the truth, he might have been swayed. That's quite a story, Bob said. And the armed men's standard procedure for finding missing family members with dementia. A chuckle, practiced and hollow. A precaution, I'm afraid. In her confused state, Victoria has made some troubling accusations. She became fixated on conspiracy theories about our company, even threatened to release fabricated evidence to harm our reputation. The security is as much for her protection as anything else. Tori moved closer to Bob, her face a mask of controlled fury. She gestured for the door, a clear request to confront her brother directly. Bob shook his head slightly, not yet. If she's here, Bob called. Seems like she went to a lot of trouble to get away from your protection, including getting caught in an illegal trap on my property and being shot at by your men. Harrison's voice hardened almost imperceptibly. I can assure you, if any of that happened, it was not at my direction. Victoria's paranoia has unfortunately made her prone to self-harm in an effort to validate her delusions. As for the trap, this is hunting country. Is it not accidents happen? Not accidents, Bob corrected. Attempted murder, trespassing, illegal surveillance, and threatening a property owner, all things the authorities might find interesting. A longer pause, and then Harrison's voice again, all pretense of warmth gone. Mr. Caldwell, let me be direct. You're an aging farmer facing foreclosure on a failing property. Your wife is dead. Your daughter has abandoned this life, and you have no future here. I'm prepared to offer you 3 times what this land is worth enough to retire comfortably anywhere you choose. All you have to do is step aside and allow us to help my sister. The mention of Eleanor and Lisa sent a surge of cold anger through Bob's veins. He glanced at Tori, who gave him a single nod permission to shift tactics. You know what's interesting about farmland? Mr. Reynolds, Bob called, his voice deceptively casual. It holds memories, not just in the house or the barn, but in the soil itself. My grandfather found arrowheads from tribes that hunted here centuries ago. My father dug up old bottles from when this place was a way station for travelers headed west. He moved closer to the door, his voice hardening. And about 3 years ago, I found something strange in the creek that runs along my eastern boundary. An oily residue that wasn't natural, fish dying off for no apparent reason. I mentioned it to my wife, who was always more curious than me. She took samples, contacted some environmental groups. Through the window, Bob could see Harrison's posture change, a slight stiffening of the shoulders. Eleanor got sick not long after that, Bob continued, watching Harrison's reaction carefully. Fast-moving cancer that took her before we could even process what was happening. Funny thing is, she kept all her research water samples, correspondence, notes about who she talked to, including several attempts to reach the CEO of Reynolds Environmental Solutions, a Victoria Reynolds. Tori's sharp intake of breath told Bob he'd hit on something she hadn't known. Her eyes were wide with sudden understanding. You have no idea what you're talking about, Harrison said, but the confidence in his voice had wavered. I think I do, Bob replied. I think your company has been poisoning my community for years. I think my wife was trying to expose it when she got sick. And I think Victoria finally found the evidence Eleanor was looking for. Enough of this, Harrison snapped. His next words were clearly directed at his men. Secure the property. Bob had been expecting this moment. He stepped back from the door just as something heavy slammed against it, a battering ram or a booted foot. The old wood cracked but held, reinforced years ago against both weather and intruders. Now, Bob called to Tori, who hit a switch by the kitchen door. Instantly, the yard was flooded with light, powerful floodlights mounted on the barn and outbuildings, positioned to illuminate every approach to the house. The sudden brightness would momentarily blind anyone outside, disrupting their night vision and tactical advantage. Bob moved quickly to a side window, where he had a clear shot at the navigator's tires. The shotgun boomed twice, and the vehicle's front end dropped as both tires deflated. No one would be making a quick escape in that. The men outside recovered quickly, taking cover and returning fire. Windows shattered as bullets tore into the farmhouse. Bob and Tori kept low, moving from position to position using routes they'd planned earlier. We need to separate them, Bob called over the gunfire. Pick them off one by one. Tori nodded, her face set with determination despite the pain from her injured leg. The barn, if we can draw some of them there. I've got something better, Bob interrupted, a plan forming. The old storm cellar, reinforced concrete, one way in, one way out. If we can get there, we can hold them off until help arrives. What help? Tori asked, ducking as another bullet splintered the window frame above her. Bob allowed himself a grim smile. I called in a few favors while you were resting earlier. Old army buddies who live a couple counties over. Should be here any minute. As if on cue, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard over the gunfire, not from the driveway, but from the back access road that wound through the western fields. Harrison won't give up easily, Tori warned, checking the ammunition in her handgun. Neither will we, Bob replied, moving toward the kitchen. There's a passage from the pantry to the storm cellar. Used it during tornado season when I was a kid. We'll have about 20 yards of open ground to cover when we exit the back of the house. Tori nodded, understanding the risk. I'll slow you down with this leg. Then I'll carry you if I have to, Bob said simply. Outside, confusion had erupted among Harrison's men as the new vehicles arrived, 3 pickup trucks carrying Bob's former Army comrades, men who had stayed in touch over the decades and who had responded immediately to his call for help. The diversion gave Bob and Tori the opening they needed. As Harrison's security team split their attention between the house and the new threat, Bob led Tori through the pantry and into the hidden passage, a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the back porch and emerged near the old oak tree that had stood sentinel over the Caldwell farm for generations. Almost there, Bob encouraged as they reached the exit. Tori's face was pale with pain, but her determination never wavered. They burst from the passage into the night air, Bob supporting much of Tori's weight as they made for the storm cellar 20 yards away. Gunfire erupted behind them as one of Harrison's men spotted their escape, but the shots went wide. Bob's friends returned fire, providing covering suppression that forced the security team to take cover. Duke appeared from the shadows, racing ahead of Bob and Tori to the storm cellar, as if guiding them to safety. They had almost reached the cellar doors when a figure stepped from behind the nearby tool shed Mercer, his weapon raised and aimed directly at them. "End of the line," he said calmly, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that rang out came not from Mercer's gun, but from behind Bob and Tori. Mercer's expression registered surprise before he crumpled to the ground, his unfired weapon falling from his grasp. Bob turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness, a young woman with his eyes and Eleanor's determined chin, a rifle held with practiced confidence in her hands. "Lisa," Bob gasped, shock momentarily overriding everything else. "Hi, Dad," Lisa Caldwell said grimly, moving forward to help support Tori. "Looks like I got home just in time." Questions flooded Bob's mind, but survival took precedence. Together, they managed to get Tori into the storm cellar, securing the heavy doors behind them. The concrete structure, built to withstand tornadoes, would hold against anything short of military-grade explosives. Inside, battery-powered lanterns cast a warm glow over the space, larger than might be expected. With supplies that spoke of Bob's preparedness, a ham radio sat on a small table, already crackling with activity. "Your friends are driving Harrison's men back," Lisa reported, listening to the radio chatter. "They've called the state police, ETA, 20 minutes. How?" "So," Bob began, still struggling to process his daughter's sudden appearance. Lisa's expression softened slightly. "I've been monitoring Reynolds Environmental for months. Dad, ever since I found Mom's research in the attic last time I visited, when I saw your name pop up in some encrypted communications I was tracking, I caught the first flight out of Seattle." Bob looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. Gone was the rebellious teenager who had fled the farm as soon as she could. In her place stood a confident young woman with skills he hadn't known she possessed. "You knew about Reynolds, about what they did to your mother." Lisa nodded, her jaw tightening in a way that reminded him painfully of Eleanor. "I suspected. I work in cybersecurity now. Been using those skills to dig into Reynolds and their subsidiaries. When Victoria Reynolds disappeared 18 months ago, I knew something big was happening." She turned to Tori, who was watching this reunion with a mixture of pain and something like hope. "I never expected to find you here. Ms. Reynolds, your encryption protocols are impressive." "Clearly not impressive enough," Tori replied with a wry smile despite her pain. "Wait," Bob interrupted, pieces clicking into place. "You knew who she was the moment you saw her." "I've been studying her case file for months," Lisa confirmed. "Reynolds Environmental is responsible for what happened to Mom and dozens of other families. Ms. Reynolds was trying to expose it all when she disappeared." Above them, the sounds of the firefight were diminishing. Harrison's men were in retreat, outmaneuvered by Bob's friends who knew the terrain intimately. "State police will be here soon," Lisa said, checking her watch. "But Harrison Reynolds won't be easily stopped. He has connections in law enforcement, politics." "We have evidence," Tori said, reaching into her pocket to produce a small, encrypted flash drive. "Everything they've done, everyone they've paid off, the complete operation." Lisa eyed the drive with professional interest. "With that and what I've already gathered, we could build a case even their lawyers couldn't dismantle." Bob looked between his daughter and Tori. These two women who had each, in their own way, been fighting the same battle he hadn't even known was being waged. A battle for truth, for justice, for Eleanor. "So what happens now?" he asked. Tori met his gaze steadily. "Now we take the fight to them, on our terms." Outside, the wail of approaching sirens cut through the night. The first battle was ending, but the war for justice was just beginning. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, Bob felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. In the storm cellar beneath the land his family had tended for generations, surrounded by the unlikely allies fate had brought together, Robert Caldwell made a silent promise to his late wife. The truth she had died seeking would finally come to light, and those responsible would face the consequences, no matter how powerful they thought they were. The storm had come to Oak Creek Valley, not the kind that could be weathered in a cellar, but the kind that would cleanse the land of long-buried poisons. And when it passed, perhaps something new could grow from soil too long contaminated by greed and corruption. 3 months after the storm broke over Oak Creek Valley, the scars remained visible: splintered wood on the old farmhouse, freshly turned earth where toxic soil was removed. A quiet cemetery where Eleanor Caldwell's grave now bears a small bronze plaque: "She sought the truth." The headlines have faded. Corporate empires rarely collapse completely, they merely transform. But in courtrooms across 5 states, the wheels of justice continue turning, grinding slowly but with purpose. Some nights, Robert Caldwell sits on his porch watching headlights on distant roads and wonders if it was all worth it. The blood spilled, the trust broken, the quiet life forever altered. Then morning comes. The sun rises over fields where clean water once again flows through ancient creek beds. In the renovated barn, environmental researchers led by a scientist with silver-streaked hair and a farmer's daughter with her mother's determined eyes document the land's slow healing. There is a different kind of harvest now, not just of corn and wheat, but of accountability, of redemption. They say the most valuable things a farmer knows cannot be written in books. They must be learned through seasons of loss and growth. Perhaps the same is true of justice. Perhaps some storms must break us before they can cleanse us. What would you risk to uncover a buried truth?